again. Welcome to another Tiny Desk sermon. Glad you have found me if you're joining me live. And if you want to be able to join us live or know when our worship services are live, make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube. And there's also a notification bell you can hit. You can click on so you get notification when things go live. Today we're going to look at the readings for this coming Sunday, which is Lectionary 18C. And should be a familiar parable we're going to look at. I'm going to just briefly mention the first reading in the Psalm. So, the first reading is Ecclesiastes, which is sort of the I don't know what the pessimistic, cynical philosophy of the Old Testament. Everything is vanity. No matter what you try to do to make sense of everything, it's all vanity. You can work for all the wealth in the world, but when you die, it's all gone, so what good did that do you? And that's the reason this is heard today, because it connects to the parable that Jesus tells. It's a really fascinating book. And the fact that it's in the Old Testament is a witness to the diversity of opinions that exist within Scripture, including Jewish Scripture. And there's no like happy ending to Ecclesiastes, even though it recognizes faith in God. It still kind of leaves you like with, you know what? It still doesn't make any sense. It's all vanity. So, worth pondering another time in more detail. Notice in the Psalm, it mentions, starting in verse 5, "Why should I be afraid in evil days when the wickedness of those at my heels surrounds me? The wickedness of those who put their trust in their own prowess and boast of their great riches. One can never redeem another, or give to God the ransom for another's life, for the ransom of a life is so great that there would never be enough to pay it." Okay, so you can't buy your way out of death. And the wickedness of those who have all this riches are often trying to do whatever they can to escape that reality, including harming other people. Okay, well, let's go to the gospel reading, which is Luke chapter 12. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." All right. Let's start off with the first part of it, which is the conversation that leads Jesus to tell this parable. And that is, there is a man who wants his brother to appropriately divide his inheritance. Now, in the Old Testament law, when there's an inheritance, the older son would receive a double portion from the younger son. So apparently the older son, we could assume, has got the inheritance, and he's not giving the younger son his share, which would be a third. So it is a legitimate request. It is a legitimate injustice being done to this man. But Jesus doesn't buy into it because he knows it's more complicated than that. So he says, I'm not here to arbitrate. I'm not here to be your estate attorney. And he said instead, be on guard against all kinds of greed, because one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. So instead of trying to do what this man wants, and he's not saying the man shouldn't get his inheritance, but instead of doing what he wants, he offers an entirely different response, an entirely different teaching about the problem of greed. So, as he always does, to make his point, to teach, he tells a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. Well, we're going to start right there for a little bit. So, to say that the land of a rich man produced abundantly would presumably be to say that this man is blessed because he has wealth and he has abundant crops. God has blessed him. That would be very ordinary to say that. But if you look at Luke's gospel and how it talks, or really much of the New Testament, and how it talks about being rich, we understand there's something else going on here. So I'm going to show you a different screen which has my Bible Works program, where I can search for a word, I can search for a Greek word, I can look things up and see where they appear in the Bible. So I did a search on the word rich, and you can see on this list here on the right, every time the word rich appears in these different texts, and I'm just focusing on the Gospels. Notice, first of all, that the word rich appears 3 times in Matthew, twice in Mark, and 13 times in Luke. So that tells you that this is a very important theme in Luke's Gospel, the theme of being rich. Now, to say a man was rich and his land produced abundantly should be to say that he is blessed. But let's look at quickly look at the occurrences of the word rich in Luke. 153. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Luke 6:24. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Luke 12:16 is our story for today, as including this ending of the parable. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. So here's a positive use of the word rich, but by completely inverting what it means. In Luke 14, we have, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. And instead invite the poor. Luke 16. There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So the rich man here is not necessarily a negative character, although it's a very complicated parable, so I'm not going to go into all that. I'm sure that's coming up soon in the lectionary. 16:19. There was a rich man who dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day, and at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus. And here the rich man, like in the parable, totally misses out on what life is really about. Luke 16:21, same parable. Luke 18:23, the man who asked Jesus about what he should do to follow him, and he says, give all your possessions away. And he said, when he heard this, he became sad, for he was very rich. How hard it is for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. Okay, it's a challenging thing. And finally in Luke, 2 more in Luke. A rich man named Zacchaeus, a tax collector, and he was rich. But he ends up being an example of how the rich can respond to the good news by giving away their ill-gotten wealth. And finally in Luke, Jesus looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury, but he saw a poor widow who only put in 2 small copper coins, all she had. So she's lifted up as the example, not the rich. So there you get a brief look at how the word rich operates in Luke's gospel. It is almost entirely negative. So now if we go back to the text. Rich man, his land produced abundantly, so he had bumper crops. So we thought, well, what should I do? I don't have enough room to store all my crops. Oh, I know, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones to store the crops. Well, that in and of itself is not necessarily bad, and we'll come back to that in a second. But then he says, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So then we get the sense that in doing all of this, he is only and entirely thinking about himself. His greed has made him self-centered. And we get the turnaround in the parable. God said, guess what? Time's up. Your life is over now. So what good did that do you to tear down your barns and build bigger ones and store up stuff for yourself instead of being rich toward God? So that's a twist in the parable. I think we should hear this parable with a kind of humorous angle that it's having, the irony of the rich man's foolishness. All that is a themes of comedy, so we should hear it that way, but it's intended to teach a lesson through the comedy. So, notice in the conversation this man has with himself, he's only thinking about and talking to himself. I will do this. I will pull down my barns. You can just see him out there standing, staring at his small barns and having a conversation with himself. And then I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. He's only having an internal conversation with himself, and then God steps in. But God said to him. The irony, of course, is he could have been having a conversation with God. He could have been praying about, oh my goodness, I've received this incredible, abundant blessing. How should I use it, oh God? What should I make of this? He doesn't do that. And it all turns out to be foolishness. All right, so what do we make of this story? Well, certainly we live in an age where we have an abundance of wealth. We live in a nation and in a moment where we have an abundance of wealth, even though we may be living in challenging economic times, and some of us are going through difficult times when others are not so much. Generally, we are living in this abundant period of time in this particular culture that we're in. And what is a sign of that? Well, it used to be that we would build houses with single-car garages. And then as things started to change, we needed bigger houses because we had more stuff, and we needed double garages, not just for 2 cars, but to store more of our stuff. And then we started to say, we don't have enough room in our houses to store all our stuff, so we need storage centers to store all our stuff. Now, I'm not opposed to having a storage center. I've had one before when we were in a moving process for a few months. But it should be a sign to us of this parable that we have to build bigger and bigger storage facilities to hold more and more of our stuff instead of contemplating what does it mean to stay with the size storage we have, whether it's our house or our garage or a storage facility, and then whatever else we have, ask God, what should we do with this? Different approach. And we often maybe only have an internal conversation with ourselves. We don't maybe often enough pray, oh God, what should I do with my wealth, whether I have a little or a massive amount? Now, the parable brings to mind a very well-known story in Genesis, which is Joseph, who gets kicked out by his brothers who are jealous of him. He, through a series of unfortunate events and coincidences and guidance by God, Joseph becomes a great leader in Egypt. And he has this gift of interpreting dreams, and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams to mean that there's a 7 years of abundant crops coming, and then drought and famine for 7 years after that. So Joseph tells them to build bigger storage barns for the crops, so that during the abundant period, they will have enough grain during the drought famine period to feed people, so there won't be such a severe famine. Now that is a very positive thing. That is planning ahead and using it not to, it could have been that Pharaoh would say, oh, okay, I'm going to store up more and more grain for myself and I'll be wealthier and wealthier. No, it was to feed the people. So this man doesn't seem to get that his abundant crop is about an opportunity to feed people. And this is really the heart of this story about why he's so foolish, and that it doesn't really help us live a full life by simply being self-centered with our possessions. And what Jesus is inviting people to is such a deep trust in God's abundant provisions for everyone that we can participate in God's blessing and abundance for everyone. So the great deep meaning about life is not from what we can accumulate, but from what we can give away from what we have. And so in this parable, wealth doesn't need to be seen as entirely negative, or in the New Testament, but it does need to be seen as a blessing, not simply for ourselves, but a blessing to be given away because of the way it can help other people. There's a very famous work written by Andrew Carnegie called The Gospel of Wealth in the early 20th century. And Carnegie being famous for having been massively wealthy, like sort of the Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Elon Musk of today, and deciding that he had an obligation to society to practice philanthropy. And so one of the things that he's known for is having funded hundreds of public libraries around the country. My own town where I grew up, Galesburg, Illinois, had a Carnegie library. And so that's a helpful example. One of the problems with Andrew Carnegie as an example was his unwillingness to change his sort of greedy business practices that allowed him to accumulate so much wealth at the expense of his workers. So you might have to not just be satisfied with philanthropy, but with economic justice as a way to think about all of these things. So for us, we have to ponder, what do we really think the fullness of life is about? Is it about, and this is sort of the American economic dream, is it about increasing our wealth and finding security in that? Or is it about taking whatever we have and participating in God's blessing for the world? And the claim here is that that's the heart of life. And Jesus invites people, whether they're poor or rich, into a life of knowing that God richly blesses us, and so we richly bless God by using what we have to further God's kingdom, to feed, to heal, to liberate, to bless others. And how sad in the parable to get to the end of your life and then say, oh my goodness, I wasted it. I wasted the opportunity to participate in the life God intends for us to have. So it's a sad, tragic ending in a comic story. But comedy usually ends with the wealthy and the proud being brought down low and being exposed as being foolish in their selfish ways. But we don't have to have that kind of tragic ending, right? Now, it doesn't mean we're going to always get this right, but it does mean we can live in this mode of saying, okay, this year we did really well, whether it's our investments or our income or our expenses were low, and I have this much that I don't really need to spend to myself or plan for my retirement. So therefore, what can I do to know the deep joy of participating in God's kingdom by using this abundance I have to bring life to others and to join with others in that life? Notice how isolated this man is in the parable. His wealth becomes very isolating, very individualistic, and kind of sadly alone. And that doesn't have to be that way. We can be engaging with people and through the joy of using what we have to bless others. And it doesn't just have to be money. It can be our abundance of skills and experience and our abundance of wisdom. And how can we use that? Where are we called in particular ways to use the particular abundance we have? A wealth not only of money and materialism, but wealth of knowledge, wealth of skill, wealth of compassion. Where are we called to use those today so that we are experiencing the fullness of God's love, not just in our lives, but with others? I like this quote I got from John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist who in the 20th century kind of, analyzed capitalism and certainly was a capitalist, but he understood that there were moments when there needs to be regulation or intervention in capitalism to keep it from destroying itself. And so this quote I found is, "Capitalism is the extraordinary belief that the nastiest of men, for the nastiest of motives, will somehow work together for the benefit of all." Well, in other words, capitalism depends on the notion of greed driving the economy. Well, you can appreciate capitalism for the benefits it brings without perhaps buying into its entire philosophy of greed as the sole valuable thing that motivates it. Could be a very different form of capitalism. That's an interesting topic for another time. I am often reminded of the powerful book by Thomas Piketty that came out maybe 10, 12 years ago called Capital, where he does this lengthy economic study of history and shows that capitalism inherently, inevitably moves toward greater and greater inequality of wealth. That the wealth always trickles up in unregulated capitalism, and therefore you have to put things in place that help keep that from being the outcome, because it leads to very negative social realities, and ultimately it leads to great instability in society. So all this is connected for me. We have to take to heart Jesus' extensive teachings about wealth and poverty. It's the topic he teaches the most on, actually, and be willing to be challenged in how we understand the blessing of wealth that each of us has, even if it's not very much, and ask, how am I today? What is the opportunity I have today to participate in God's love and abundance for the world with what I have to give? And that should be seen as an opportunity, not as a threat. The ending of the parable is not saying that God rejected this man for all eternity. It's just God pointing out the tragedy of this man having wasted these opportunities because he was too greedy and too selfish. So that's my take on this wonderful parable, which I will be pondering some more for Sunday. Hope you can join us Sunday for live stream worship at 10 a.m. on this very YouTube channel. And I have one more session planned for my adult forum I'm doing right now called The Way of Jesus. And then I'll be working on plans for adult forums in the fall. Those will most likely be not early Sunday morning, but often in the evening on Zoom, and possibly some of them will be after worship on Sunday morning, so like 11:30. If you're interested in participating in adult forums, I would love to hear from you and what you would like to study or discuss as a topic. Could be something biblical, theological, spiritual, historical, topical, political in the best sense of the word, about how we organize our lives publicly, not about partisan politics. So let me know if you have an interest. Email me or call me up and let me know. Thank you for joining me or for tuning in later, and hope I get to see you sometime soon, and blessings to you in the real sense of blessing.